next presenter is Alex Marienthal, and Alex has been a forecaster at the Gallatin National Forest Avalanche Center since 2015-16, and he worked for a number of years for the Friends of the Avalanche Center up there, education coordinator. He ski patrolled at Bridger Bowl, which I hear actually from Alex that's one of his favorite things. He likes to do that as a hobby. I don't know, work as a hobby? He's got his master's in snow science from Montana State on forecasting deep slab avalanches on persistent weak layers. We don't know anything about that, or we don't want to know anything about that, do we? He grew up skiing and navigating the mountains of Colorado and has skied all around the West. Alex is going to talk to us about pros and cons of different stability tests. Before I bring Alex up on stage, I want to thank him in front of everybody for being a gopher, doing a huge job for me every summer, collecting the National Avalanche Center summaries for the Avalanche Review. So I really appreciate all your work with that, Alex. So there we go, Alex Marienthal.
Thanks, Lynn, for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to help you out with the Avalanche Review. And thank you, everybody, for being here on this beautiful day. How many people here do stability tests, extended column test, propagation saw test, compression test for work or for recreation? I think I saw most hands go up, but maybe not all of them. Hopefully this will encourage you to dig more and keep digging, although there may be some surprising or results we haven't seen before. Before I get into our research, I'll just say a quick thank you to the folks who helped us collect data, all these forecasters listed at that first bullet point there. We solicited data from them for this study, and they were really helpful, mostly from the GNFAC, Utah, Colorado, and the guys from Sierra Avalanche Center. And then Doug Chabot and Carl Birkeland, who helped me with this research, they kind of came up with how to get some of this data and pushing this idea forward, and they've been some of my greatest mentors through my career. And then Jim Earle, who maintains and updates the snowpilot.org software and database, and that allows us to do this sort of research, as well as everyone here and everyone in the community who uses snowpilot.org and puts your data in there. That gives us a lot to ask, a lot to work with when we have these questions. And Grom gave a talk yesterday where he used a ton of that data as well. So if you're not using Snowpilot, start checking it out, and if you are, keep it up. Thank you. So we wanted to look at the effectiveness of the ECT, PST, and CT in terms of false stable and false unstable rates. And I'm not going to go into the details of each of these tests. I assume people are familiar with those, and if not, check out the snow, weather, and avalanche guidelines for specifics. But we look at false stable rates. This is kind of the most consequential outcome. If we get a stable result on a slope that's actually unstable, it can lead to injury or death if that slope is opened or skied or ridden. False unstable rates are slightly less consequential. If we avoid a stable slope because we got an unstable result, we'll miss out on some power riding or maybe opening terrain or opening a roadway, but it's unlikely that's going to lead to death or injury. These are both really important, though, because we want to reduce the rates of each of these in order to have a more accurate test. If we have too high a false unstable rates, then we lose trust in the test. So both of those we want to see low numbers. And we calculate the false stable and false unstable rates using this contingency table. Scotty showed this a little bit yesterday, and some of you may be familiar. But we have our test results on the left axis there that need to be binary, either stable or unstable, so we have to choose thresholds for each test of where we'd say that's a stable or an unstable result. And then we compare those to the observed or true stability on the slope that the test was done on. And that part's really tricky because we typically don't actually know the true stability of slopes. And I'll get into how we did that in this study, but a variety of methods have been used where people dig next to avalanches and assume that's an unstable slope, or they ski or explosive test slopes, and the ones that slide are unstable and the ones that don't are stable, and they dig pits on all those. But even that's not precise, because when we have an avalanche, even digging in the crown or the flanks, there's a reason that snow didn't slide. Maybe it's because of slope angle or something, but we've dug in a lot of avalanche crowns and flanks, and it's hard to say even if the snow next to the avalanche is stable or unstable. So that's a very tricky part of the problem, is defining true slope stability. We get our false stable rate by adding up the total false stables in a data set and dividing that by the total number of unstable slopes in that data set. And the false unstable rate comes from the total number of false unstables in a data set divided by the total number of stable slopes in that data set. There's been a lot of previous research looking at this stuff. I won't get into all the details, and it's kind of an intimidating stack of numbers there, but the folks and dates of who did the research and when they did it are on the left there. The tests that they looked at are in that next column, and then this slide is showing the false stable rates and then their sample size. And so previous research has found 0 to 40% false stable rates for the ECT, 22 to 44% for the PST, and 0 to 48% for the CT. These all have the similar higher end of the false stable rates, up in the 40%, but it's notable that the ECT and CT, a lot of the studies find 0 to 10%, so those tend to have some research backing up that those have lower false stable rates than the PST. For false unstable rates, it was 2 to 44% for the ECT, 0 to 14% for the PST, and 8 to 79% for the compression test. And the compression test is one that tends to have a high false unstable rate, so that compromises the accuracy of that test and makes it a bit less useful in some situations. For our research, we looked at 2 data sets. The first one that we solicited from all those forecasters in the western US, they collected data over 4 winters and came up with 561 pits that we were able to use in this study. And then we also looked at a larger data set querying the entire SNOPilot database from 2007 to 2020, and we came up with 3,313 pits that had a stability test and the required amount of information for us to look at these false stable and false unstable rates. In that first data set, which we'll call the professional data set, in quotes even because that SNOPilot data set has plenty of professional data in it as well. But for this talk, we'll call that the professional data set. And we had forecasters dig a pit and rate the slope stability before they did any tests. And we had them use this scale on the bottom that's adapted from Table G1 in SWAG. Table G1 just has 5 levels. This one we added 2 in the middle so that forecasters couldn't just say fair. They had to choose fair stable or fair unstable so that we could easily classify the slope that they did the tests on as stable or unstable. So if it was one of the ratings on the left, it was called stable. If it was on one of the ratings on the right, the slope was called unstable. And then we also had them give a rating after they did the tests. And the reason we had them do it before is because after they do the test, that information is going into their stability rating, so it's kind of the circular reasoning that we're trying to cut down on. In the SNOPilot data set, we didn't have this before test rating, but we used the user's assigned stability rating from SNOPilot, which is based on this scale with just the fair option in the middle. And if the pits didn't have a rating or if it was rated fair, we used, if they noted signs of instability like avalanches or collapsing on similar slopes, then we classified their pit as unstable. And if it was fair without those signs, it went into the stable category. For the tests that we looked at to determine whether a test was stable or unstable, for the ECT, we divided, if it propagated, we called it unstable. If it didn't, if it was an N or an X, we called it stable. We also did the calculations by classifying the tests based on criteria from Teckel et al. 2020, where he suggests that ECTPs less than or equal to 22 are unstable, ECTNs greater than 8 are stable, and in between is fair. So we used those cutoffs, and for that calculation, we eliminated the fair results. So we had a little smaller N value for those. For the PST, if it was cut length less than 50% and propagated to the end, it was unstable, and if it was greater than 50% or didn't propagate to the end, we called it stable. And then we looked at 3 criteria for the compression test. One was anything with less than 21 hits was unstable. Then we looked at putting shear quality in there, so if it was less than 21 hits, or if it had a Q1 shear or a sudden collapse or sudden planar fracture character, it was unstable. And then finally, we looked at just the shear quality regardless of the number of taps. So if it had a Q1 sudden collapse or sudden planar, we called it unstable, no matter how many hits it took for initiation. So we had essentially looked at 4 data sets. We did the calculations looking at that pro data set using the before ratings for the observed slope stability. And then we calculated it using the after ratings. And so this is for our ECTs. And you can see how those after ratings, the percentage drops quite a bit as the forecasters had some more information. And then in the large snow pilot data set, we looked at the whole data set, and then we also took out those 561 pits from that professional data set in order to see if that affected the results. So for the ECT, we found false stable rates of 16 to 31% and false unstable rates of 23 to 44%. And then the PST, we found false stable rates of 19 to 36% and false unstable rates of 34 to 37%. So those higher ends are kind of similar to previous research, maybe a little lower in some cases, and then the lower end of that range, they're a little more similar than we previously thought, a little higher for the ECT and maybe a little lower false stable rates for the PST. An interesting note on this slide is that bottom 2 rows there is where we took the professional data that we solicited out of the data set. The false stable rate for the PST increased pretty significant amount. It's also should note on the sample size was about half. So half the PSTs in our whole data set were collected in that larger professional data set that we solicited. And this is interesting, it kind of implies that the PST requires more skill to perform in order to keep your saw on the weak layer to identify appropriate times to do the PST. If you don't have a clear weak layer slab combo, it's a much harder test to do or just not going to work. And for the compression test, we have the 3 criteria we looked at there. We had false stable rates of 8 to 45% and false unstable rates of 39 to 86%. So again, really high false unstable rates that compromises the accuracy of that test, even though if we just look at like shear quality, or if we look at the CT with shear quality, you can really reduce the false stable rates, but it's not super useful if you get a lot of false unstables. An interesting result that we hadn't really intended to look at when we started soliciting that data, but once we got the data from the professionals, we were wondering how often they changed their stability rating after performing tests. And not just from stable to unstable, but just one step on that scale of 6, even if it was from very good to good, or if it might have stayed on one side. And we found that 29% of the time they changed their rating after doing a stability test. And 11% of the time it changed from stable to unstable or unstable to stable. And this is just really telling that despite these higher false stable, false unstable rates that we may be seeing, the tests are still providing forecasters useful information and dialing in their stability assessment for regional stability of similar slopes. And so a basic suggested application that we have for kind of combining the three of these tests to explore potential for initiation, what the structure is, what propagation potential is. At just kind of a baseline level, whether it's professional or recreational, if you don't have a very intimate knowledge of the snowpack, we'd start with an extended column test to make the best use of time and energy, because with that you can get an idea of initiation, how hard it is to initiate, and what the propagation potential is. If you don't get any initiation or propagation, we might take a step back and do a CT just to make sure we're not missing any layers. That's with that smaller column, it might show some interfaces pop out easier. And if neither of those show interfaces or layers, like I had mentioned, then the PST is probably not going to be useful. If you can't find a weak layer to drag your saw through, you're not going to be able to use the PST. But if a weak layer is obvious from one of those two tests, or if it's known from previous data or from the forecast, then the PST would be a good further assessment for propagation potential. And there's definitely situations where some of these tests will be better than the others. We a lot of times focus on the ECT and PST because they do have a little better accuracy and they have that propagation propensity component. So as you get more experience, you can start to figure out times when both are good, and if it's really deep and the ECT is not working, then the PST may be better. Sometimes that goes for shallow situations as well. The recent Avalanche review has a really good discussion on digging snow pits that Lynn curated and put together. There's a lot of good minds weighing in on that, so I suggest checking that out in terms of some more discussion on how to apply snow pits, and I think encouragement on continuing to dig snow pits. And despite that, they might not be the best predictor of is this slope stable or not, can I ski it? They still provide us a lot of information, and the circle on the right there is the key information that we can look for with snow pits. The structure, do we have a slab over a weak layer? What's the propagation potential for that? And the strength from the initiation. And Grom had a good slide yesterday in his talk, where these pies were not all equal and the strength was a little bit narrower, which I think is probably a pretty appropriate weighting to focus mostly on structure and propagation. If those two things are concerning, then it might not matter how hard it is to initiate. And then this is from Carl Birkeland's talk at ISSW. He reviewed the ECT, Roosh block, PST, and CT. Just kind of a review of our understanding of them to date. And this chart is showing like the ECT, Roosh block, CT are all good for looking for structure, slab over a weak layer. The PST is not quite as good for that. You kind of already have to know the structure. It's not going to show you that it's there. The ECT, Roosh block, and CT are good for assessing initiation. The PST partly, it's not quite as clear. We're not tapping on it a set number of times, but there is some thought that a shorter cut length may correlate to easier initiation. And then the ECT, PST, and Roosh block are all good for assessing propagation potential. The CT, not so much. We don't have that long column. There's thought that a higher shear quality or a lower shear quality, cleaner shears could indicate higher propagation potential. But again, doing a little bit longer ECT is going to be more clear. And then their relative accuracy, which we just did this study on. Scotty mentioned maybe yesterday, he mentioned 3 pluses there might be a little optimistic. But relative to each other, the ECT roosh block are pretty good accuracy. I think the PST is similar to those two, and then the CT is going to be pretty much useless to tell you whether a slope is stable or not. So to summarize, ECTs, we found ECTs and PSTs perform similarly in terms of false stable and false unstable rates when conducted by Avalanche professionals. We did see that ECTs have somewhat lower false stable rates and false unstable rates in the larger data set when we took out that professional data. So again, indicating that PSTs probably take more skill to identify an appropriate situation and to keep your saw in the weak layer. And then finally, after performing stability tests, we saw that forecasters changed their slope stability rating almost a third of the time. So despite some high false stable and false unstable rates, stability tests are useful in telling us about the bigger picture and helping us answer questions about initiation and propagation potential and what the structure is. So I'd encourage you to keep digging, be curious, use snow pits to confirm your hypothesis out there. I think I hear a lot of talk these days of like, oh, I'll avoid avalanche terrain and then I don't have to dig, which is ideal if you truly avoid avalanche terrain all the time, but I think all of us eventually start to get curious about steeper slopes, and that's probably not the first time you want to be digging and trying to figure out these things. So the more you can dig, the more they're going to be applicable when you really need them, and the better you'll be at them. And I'll open it up for questions and discussion.
Questions. Who's got questions for Alex? I have a question.
I bet.
So it's a little bit of a trick question, but I think you probably know the answer to it, based on a paper that Chabot did at ISSW a few years ago. What's better than one ECT that you dig?
Probably 2 ECTs.
Yeah.
In different, yeah. Well, I do 2 in the same spot just to make sure, but Doug is a really big proponent of doing 2 or 3 tests in different locations and trying to reduce that effective spatial variability.
And some of your criteria in choosing where to dig an ECT, and this is, I'm not really grilling Alex because I expect as a longtime forecaster he knows the answer to this, but it's a little bit of a review for you and for us because guess what, it's October and the season's coming up. So criteria for how do you choose a spot to dig your ECT?
Well, we want a representative location of the snowpack that you're curious about, but I think the key part that Doug and Carl have found over the last decade is that you don't have to be on steep slopes. You can be on slopes less than 30 degrees, you can be on flat slopes, as long as the structure is similar to the slope you're worried about, you're gonna get the same result essentially. And so you can, the key there is you can find safe locations to dig, and you don't have to be right in the starting zones.
You think I'm going to say, very good, Alex, you're right. Of course he is. So team out here, what do you do before you start digging? What's your preferred tool? Yeah, your probe. So you're looking for representative depths, not too deep, not too shallow, but kind of like baby bear, just right. Yeah. Great. Other questions? Great. Thanks, Alex. You can find him at the coffee break.